Leah Milne. Uh, so Leah is here to talk about her debut book, I believe it was, her first book, Novel Subject. So Leah is an associate professor of English at the University of Indianapolis and a director of graduate studies in English as well. Leah got her own PhD from University of North Carolina, with her dissertation having led to this book, I believe. You said that in a podcast that I listened to recently, that this was exactly what you're going to talk about later as well, how to turn your dissertation into a book as well. The novel subject, authorship as radical self-care in multi-ethnic American narratives, which also won the Midwest Modern Language Association 2021 Book Award. So congratulations for Leah for that as well. So without further ado, I welcome you and go for it.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for attending this event. I know, especially for my Eastern Standard Time folks, this is the middle of the day, so I appreciate that. Thank you to Aya for organizing, to everyone in the British Association for American Studies USSO community. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. All right. Now I have to shuffle things around. If you would think after this point in the pandemic that we would all be pros at Zoom. But if you see me moving things around on my screen or panicking a little, that's what's going on. So as you can see from my opening slide here, I'm speaking to you all from the traditional homelands of the Miami, Shawnee, Peoria, Potawatomi, Lenape, and Kickapoy peoples here in Indianapolis and Indiana. My contact information is on this slide, and I invite all of you to please email me if you have any questions. We'll also have, as I mentioned, a Q&A at the end of the session. So I wanted to start this USSO book hour with some basic information. I was lucky to have some really good readers and reviewers of the dissertation that then became the manuscript, one of whom is cited here at the bottom. So Min Song, who was one of my reviewers for the manuscript at University of Iowa Press. This is the blurb that they created in commemoration of the book award that I mentioned. So novel subjects, authorship as radical self-care and multi-ethnic narratives. It started as my dissertation project when I graduated from the University of North Carolina in Greensboro in 2015. As I will explain at the end of this presentation, I took a little break, or maybe a very long break, and then it was eventually published in 2021, in July of 2021. The book prize came around in January of 2022. And so, yeah, I will talk a little bit at the end about the process of starting with the dissertation, ending up with the book. But onto the book itself. So novel subjects refers to what I call scenes of writing. So scenes of writing in multi-ethnic US works, primarily contemporary novels that fall under the category of metafiction or self-referential fiction. And so I'll start by defining this term very broadly in terms of fiction about fiction. This is a trope that encompasses all kinds of narratives, genres, forms of media, and so on. And in my study, I focus specifically on these scenes of writing and composition that are related to authorship. So you can also call these scenes of authorship and of fictional or fictionalized characters as authors. And specifically, when I was looking to kind of limit my focus, I chose texts that were that very much had these moments as kind of prominent elements in the plot, and the authors themselves as protagonists playing key roles in the narrative as well. So when we're thinking about kind of issues of authorship in text, I think there's a lot of kind of tricky things that we have to deal with, in part because when we're talking about authorship, we're also talking about a built-in level of authority and privilege. And so how do we talk about marginalized groups when we have already kind of this baseline aspect of privilege that is also tied to the privileges of writing and literacy in the first place, and the privileges and powers of being published, which I differentiate here from the privilege of being read and understood. So we're dealing with this, and then we're also dealing with metafiction, which also has its own kind of assumptions. some of those embedded assumptions can be best represented by this MC Escher sketch that we see here. So we can talk about how critics often dismiss metafiction as narcissistic navel gazing, done primarily by white heterosexual men. Uh, in one way, we can kind of counter Spider-Man and say that privilege does not come with responsibility in these assumptions, and that in fact, when we look at what some of those examples are, it seems to hold true. And it's harder to see these things when you do have that privilege, whether that's privilege in the publishing industry or just in life in general. So when we look at this reputation of narcissism in metafiction, we can see that to a certain extent, the things that are out there resemble the stereotype. So we could talk about Kurt Vonnegut or Chuck Palahniuk, Vladimir Nabokov, and so on. But when we're looking at metafiction and the history of metafiction, we can actually see that authors of all genders, from all ethnicities, from all across time have been writing metafiction. And when I was looking at, for my project, like what has been happening with this in the past few decades, what we see is that probably as early as the 90s leading up into the present, there have just been a lot more metafiction that's written by authors of marginalized groups. So just to give you some examples, if you look at the 4 novels, The Sentence, Days of Distraction, The Poet X, and Insurrecto, these were all published too late for me to even consider for the dissertation, let alone the book manuscript. And so we're starting to see just kind of this trend that is, I think, becoming very more prominent. So when I was writing the first version of this, a dissertation version, I was actually considering a couple of questions. And the first of these is just thinking about how do we talk about contemporary US literature and this tension between the power and responsibility that comes with authorship, and then the lack of power, lack of access to power that comes with being part of a marginalized group. And then the second question related to how we might use works of metafiction to challenge this idea of authorship as neutral or universal. So I tied these to the resurgence of multiculturalism. So this is one of the 2 kind of movements that I think this is definitely tied to. And when we're thinking about multiculturalism, we're thinking about a very specific time period in the US, where not only were we tolerating, but in some cases we were actually celebrating in the US government and corporations, popular culture, and so on, diversity in all its forms, especially in national, indigenous, cultural, and ethnic forms. And so these images here are images that I associate with this kind of surge in popularity of multicultural thinking. So the cover of the Time magazine from 1993, representing, quote, the new face of America, and it being very tied to this idea of immigration and multiculturalism. And then in the center, we have Tejana singer-songwriter Selena, being chosen very deliberately as kind of this multicultural representative for Coca-Cola. And so there's all these ways in which multiculturalism was not just something that was being discussed in the university, but also in corporations. It was kind of out in the ether. So in the literary world, we have all kinds of examples of the influence of multiculturalism. We have institutionalizations of programs like African American and Asian American studies, but we also see the literature representing more marginalized authors. So 3 novels here, Julia Alvarez, Amy Tan, Art Spiegelman. So these were books that were all published in 1991, just to give you an example of kind of where the publishing industry was going as far as this trend in the US. So this is why I placed the start of novel subjects as being after 1989, because I thought it would be interesting to start with the height of US multiculturalism and then move forward to from there to see kind of multiculturalism's wane, and then where we see US literature sort of picking things up from there. So when we're thinking about how metafiction actually reframes multiculturalism, we can talk about how metafiction revises and ultimately reconstructs the dominant narratives that multiculturalism offers. So, for example, if we think about Black History Month, oftentimes Black History Month, especially when we're talking about it in popular culture, it celebrates exceptional individuals. And this is akin to the way that the model minority operates, kind of this myth of like the exceptional Asian American, or before that, the exceptional Jewish American, um, which seems like it's centering a particular group, but it's ultimately pushing to the margins kind of the normal or ordinary within those groups. We can also talk about multiculturalism as celebrating only certain kinds of authentic individuals, such as only primitivized versions of indigenous people. And so in this kind of guise of celebration, we also see um, the ways in which these caricatures or these stereotypes come into being. And so this is part of why I think kind of focusing on metafiction allows us to look at the process of storytelling and identity formation. So this brings me to my second focus in terms of metafiction, and this is that we can think about metafiction for these particular marginalized authors as a form of self-care. So as I say in my introduction, rather than throwing multiculturalism out entirely, the text and novel subjects show the value of incorporating multiculturalism's foundational attentions into larger conversations on equity and self-care. So I thus show through these texts how the privileges of authorship and self-conscious metafictional forms of writing they can exemplify, but also portray and enact forms of self-care. So this is self-care that specifically wrests control away from these dominant multiculturalist narratives and then replaces them with more ethical and more intimate forms of storytelling and identity formation. So one of the other ways to think about this is, just as we talked about how multiculturalism has at its foundation these values that are really important to these authors, we can also talk about self-care and how self-care has become this sort of commercialized, kind of whitewashed um, values set on retail therapy or shopping therapy and so on. And so it's become kind of corporate. And so similarly, multiculturalism made this move that then sort of entered into the corporate era, and we lost kind of the basics of it. And so when I talk about the basics of self-care, I'm talking specifically about the politicized, but also practical version that Audre Lorde talks about, where she defines self-care as moving away from these kind of individual-centered corporate models and more towards this idea of self-preservation and an act of political warfare. And so we can think about how the authors that I was looking at really dealt with this self-care as being kind of an opportunity for creativity, and for creativity in terms of their storytelling, but also in terms of their interaction between readers and writers. So in this sense, we can talk about authorship and the telling of one's own story and identity as being forms of protest. So forms of protest, ways of taking control of the narrative, of how one is perceived or read, and then speaking back to and then replacing the narratives that these dominant frameworks have taken over. So I'll show you one example, and then we'll go over the content of the book itself, and then we'll come back and look at two more examples. So starting with the introduction, which is entitled Vindictively American. This is a quote from Ralph Ellison. And in the introduction, I deal with two books, but the one I'm going to talk about here is Toni Morrison's Home. So this is her 2012 novel. And in the novel, we see Frank, who is the protagonist, and he's dealing with the trauma of returning to his hometown after fighting in the Korean War. And so one of the ways he tries to heal from this trauma is by negotiating the way that his story is told with the storyteller. And one of the things that you'll see about metafiction is the language to kind of describe it is very clunky. In this case, I'm calling this person the storyteller. We can call this a version of Toni Morrison herself. Right. And so anyway, Frank is trying to get the storyteller of the novel Home to recognize their limitations in telling the story. So recognize your limitations, their vulnerabilities. At one point, you see Frank actually tell the narrator or the storyteller, "Don't paint me as some enthusiastic hero. I had to go, but I dreaded it." And so there's lots of ways that we can think about this particular interaction between Frank and the storyteller. We can talk about how our inclination is to valorize, but not really take care of our veterans, for example. But if we're thinking about it in the multicultural framework, I think we can also tie this to Black History Month and how we we put on a pedestal certain exceptional individuals without talking about the struggle that comes into the storytelling process. So this kind of negotiation, I don't want this to feel like it's an easy process. I think that one of the things that we see in these novels is the struggle that comes with the negotiation and renegotiation of how these stories are told. And that really is at the heart of this. Like, this is not just a happy celebration, but this is something that takes work. And this is where that radical element comes in terms of self-care. So just to go into, I'll just go over the chapters, starting with the introduction. As I mentioned, Toni Morrison's Home is a part of it, but then I also include the classic Ceremony 1977 work by Leslie Marmon Silko. Chapter 1 is where I get the title novel subjects from. In that one, I actually talk about 2 more recent works. So this chapter is focused on the interaction between post-colonialism and multiculturalism. And it talks a lot about mental health as it relates to multiculturalism. And so one of the things that I do in discussing the 2010 novel, The Gun Dealer's Daughter by Gina Fostal, and Louise Erdrich's Shadow Tag, which was also published in 2010, we see that there's lots of ways in which multiculturalism sort of centers their celebration on whole subjects. So whole subjects who don't have any kind of mental struggles, or those mental struggles are kind of muted because we're just kind of in celebratory mode, right? And so we see these 2 protagonists not only questioning that assumption, but then also using writing as a subversive form of protest. In chapter 2, it's titled Against Authenticity. And in this one, I use Jonathan Safran Foer's 2002 novel, Everything is Illuminated. And I read that alongside 2 works by Carmen Maria Machado, specifically her short story, The Resident, which is in her 2017 award-winning collection, Her Body and Other Parties. And then I also go a bit into her 2019 memoir, In the Dream House. So in this chapter, I'm looking specifically at, as said from the chapter title, versions of authenticity and how those are kind of imposed upon people by multiculturalism, and then also how this connects to ideas of truth and testimony. And so there's lots of ways in which authorship and truth and testimony kind of interact in these books. Chapter 3, I'll actually go over this one. This is going to be one of the examples I talk about, is Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being from 2013. But then I also talk in this chapter about Nicole Krauss's 2010 novel, Great House. And as evident from the title of this one is dealing with kind of material aspects of metafiction, so looking at kind of object-centered analysis. And then I also deal with American exceptionalism and the model minority, because as I mentioned, the model minority has a history with both Jewish American and with Asian American groups. Chapter 4, so this one, the title comes from Miguel Sahuco's Ilustrado, which I read alongside Percival Everett's 2013 novel, Percival Everett by Virgil Russell, which I'll talk a bit, that'll be my second example after this. I also make quite a few nods, because how can you not in a metafictional work, to Erasure by Percival Everett. With these, I'm looking specifically at the way that these authors blur the lines between authors and readers, both fictional and non-fictional, and then also how they use this to think about scales of authorship. So how do we read authorship along these different scales? And then this connects to the idea of what it means to redefine and rewrite multiculturalism. And then finally, in the epilogue, so this deals with ghostliness and haunting through Kiese Lemon's Long Division and Matt Johnson's response to Edgar Allan Poe with the novel Pym. So in the conclusion, I deal a lot with the ways that ghosts, thinking about Avery Gordon and her work on sociology and ghosts, what ghosts ask us to do. And we can think about all these works as being haunted by the authorial presence, whether we're talking about the real life authors or the authors in the text. So this is a way to think about kind of the limiting definitions of race, and just one final thought about that, how that relates to us and our responsibility as readers. So let me go back to 2 examples. So the first one from chapter 4. So this is Percival Everett by Virgil Russell. And as can already be seen from the title, this is one of a few titles where Percival Everett actually references his own name in the title. In this one, we have actually two Percival Everetts. So we've got Percival Everett Sr., Percival Everett Jr. They act as characters who collaborate, who tell each other stories, who work together to tell other stories within the text. And a lot of this is related to kind of relationship building, the way that the challenges that they face in their relationship. And in the process, they also tell stories about art, about family, mental and physical health, and so on. At many points, it becomes a bit challenging to kind of distinguish between the authors. All of that is on purpose. We're talking about what it means to kind of blur borders here. And we see the power in doing so, just as we did with Toni Morrison's Home. We see that leads to all these ways of negotiating and interacting with each other. One final example. So this is from chapter 3, Material Metafiction and the Life-Changing Magic of All Myriad Things. So this one focuses partly on Ruth Ozeki's 2013 novel, A Tale for the Time Being. And if the title looks familiar, it's because I kind of stole it. There's a lot about stolen writing and plagiarism and stuff in my book as well. So I kind of plagiarized this a bit from Marie Kondo's The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, which we can also call a kind of self-care that itself has been commercialized, whitewashed, misunderstood, and so on. When we look at what Ozeki's novel is doing, we see that there's this character named Ruth Ozeki, who we'll call Ruth, and she's reading this journal that's written by this teenage fictional author named Now. And Now is writing this journal and imagining a future reader. And so one of the ways that we can think about how this disrupts or sort of scalar assumptions about authorship is we think because Ruth is in the future or in the later time reading something that a person has written in the past, that there's no way in which these would interact in time and space. But what happens in Ozeki's novel is this relationship is actually circular. So both writers have power to influence the other in very surprisingly personal and intimate ways that also shapes their self-assessments, their own perspectives, and so on. This is a bit of a spoiler alert, but at one point we actually see Ruth sort of cross the boundaries of fiction, and she crosses into the fictional story world of Now and Now's grandmother, and then she deliberately affects the plot of that story. So one of the ways to think about this is how much these author characters do what Sarah Ahmed calls a kind of acts of willfulness and intrusiveness. So they intrude upon and they interrupt the metafictional tales that they tell, while at the same time willfully insisting upon telling those tales in the first place. And often they do so through an over-reliance on unconventional or unaccepted or even seemingly inauthentic methods and approaches. Before we go to Q&A, I said I was going to say a little bit about my dissertation to book process. Keep in mind that in a lot of ways I was very lucky to get the job that I did, in part because there was no real rush to get a book out. And so I had kind of personal and professional circumstances that worked in my favor. But this is what worked for me. Oh, and the other thing I should say is that I worked with a smaller press. So University of Iowa Press, one of the things that they pride themselves on is because they aren't too big, they are able to move quickly than some of your other bigger presses out there. So with those caveats in place, here's what I did. So I miss the time in my life where I used to wake up and my to-do list was write the dissertation like every day. So anyway, write the dissertation, graduate. And then for me, again, this is unique to me, but I was able to just ignore it for a little while. And the reason why this was helpful is, hopefully this is not true for you, but for me, by the end of the process, I really hated it. I hated everything about it. I didn't want to look at it anymore. And so this gave me a good emotional and psychological and intellectual break from it. And that break can be as long as time allows. So until you like it and you want to start it again, or in my case, it just felt like a good time in terms of the job, in terms of life, and so on. After that, I really had to find ways of being accountable, because no longer could I say, what's on the to-do list today? It's write the thing. that was like 8th or 9th on the list, right? Like everything else came first. And all those things include just regular basic life stuff. But in terms of your professional to-do list, you're teaching, right? You're trying to pay the bills. And so ways of being accountable for me included writing accountability groups, conferences, anything that had an external deadline allowed me to kind of push myself to make this a priority in terms of my writing. And then step 4, I kind of put these together just because I was doing a little bit of both all the time, researching how to write book proposals, what was involved in that. And you'll find that each press has unique kind of demands, and then revising as I went along. 2 books that I want to pitch. So the first one is one that was really foundational to me, and this was William Germano's From Dissertation to Book. Highly, highly recommend it. I also got a lot of social media advice, not like me directly, but on social media, I got a lot of advice from Laura Portwood Stacer, and she just put out a book recently called The Book Proposal Book, which if it's anything like her tweets, like it's going to be useful. So I highly recommend those 2. I'll end with a couple of lessons that I learned from this process. And this, if you take nothing away from this, take this away. Allocate time for your writing. So treat it like you do a meeting, treat it like you do class. I'm saying this because I haven't been good about this myself. It's the first thing on the calendar that you treat as flexible, and that's not great if you really want to get your writing done. So if you're treating it like a meeting, then if somebody wants to meet with you at that time, you say, sorry, I can't. And then you meet yourself with your writing, right? Put it on your calendar, like make it formal. And then the other thing that I would say is to think about the fact that what you write now is going to change. It will change because you change, but it will also change because the people who are going to be reading this, like the audience that you're addressing for your graduate work is going to be very different from the audience that you're addressing later. And you can think about this in terms of your readers or reviewers for the press, or you can think about this just in terms of who's going to read your work once it gets published. And then similarly, I wrote novel subjects for a series. So this is not just University of Iowa Press, but specifically the New American Canon series. And they had a particular focus that worked really well with my book. But it may be the case that you fall in love with the series, or the series editors are really appealing to you, or there's just a press whose values you appreciate that you want to align yourself with, and you may find yourself kind of revising for that as well. So yeah, that is all I have, and I know that there was some questions, so I'm really looking forward to that. But thank you again for letting me talk to you about my book.
Thank you, Leah. That was fantastic. So much information there that I'm sure hopefully we'll get a lot of questions for. I just wanted to also note that through kind of sticking to the subject and the theme of your topic, giving a nod to the indigenous people of the land that you're occupying, or everyone is occupying, is a very nice touch as well. Because I just read that Angela Davis, because I'm researching her as part of my research, and she starts every conference and every spiel she does by doing that, especially when she's in the US or in areas where she knows that happens. So I thought that was a very kind of nice start for your multi-ethnic or multicultural presentation. So
Thanks. Yeah, we're working on it here at UND. I mentioned things that will take your time, like this. I'm on a thing called the Land Acknowledgement Task Force, and we're working to get that being kind of a normal part of the normal culture here at UND. So it's something that I'm doing partly for me, but also just as a way to get used to it. I do it in my syllabi too. We can definitely talk about things like that. Yeah.
That's very interesting, and I think it should be a kind of regular thing, especially if you're in those kind of areas where it's more prominent as well. I would like to invite everyone to join the Q&A if you have any questions. I'm sure we've all done this online thing for such a long time now that you could raise your hand or use the chat function. And Sarah, if you could have a look if there's anything in the chat then as well. As I'm unfortunately working on the tablet, I can't see the hands raised if there's any. And if there's not any yet, I'm happy to kind of put my 2 cents in to start with, because I had a couple of questions. One thing just from the end there that I picked up on, before I forget, is that you made yourself available, or you did a lot of conferences while you were working for the dissertation to book. So did you write a chapter by chapter sort of and kind of find a conference where to present and kind of test out the ideas? How did the conferencing kind of play a role in processing dissertation into a book? Because a lot of us probably have done that we try out our dissertation in conferences. So is there something you could say about that a bit more?
Hang on, I think I need to change one of the settings. Bear with me.
The joys of technology, as always.
Okay, you should be able to.
Okay, there we go. All right. Yeah. So here's what I'll say was most useful for me in terms of thinking about the conference is the good conference presentations, in my opinion, focus on like one specific idea and then you get feedback on that one idea. What I tried to do and what I would not recommend you do when I first started out was I tried to condense the entire thing into a conference presentation, right? And so then you're just like, here's 8 books that I'm going to talk about in like 18 minutes, right? So instead of that, I would say one way to make conference presentations most useful is choose the thing that works with the conference theme, but choose the thing that you want to revise first. Or at that time that you're thinking of doing this presentation. And then have it be just one aspect, like one book or even one set of scenes from one book, and then use that as kind of the basis for your conference presentation. You can also solicit specific feedback when you're there, right? So say like, this is a work in progress. I would really love it if anybody had any suggestions or questions about this specific part of it, right? Because then there's all kinds of things that people might be interested in that you've already thought out, or maybe things that you hadn't thought out that you want to know more about. So yeah, I would use your resources. Like it's a good way to give yourself, like I said, an external deadline, but then to give yourself time to focus on one specific aspect.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay.
And one more question for me, and then I'll leave, because I saw someone was maybe in the chat putting questions. So I'll ask mine first selfishly, because being such an interesting book and being such an important topic and quite new to probably a lot of us as a focus, could you talk about how you teach novel subjects or similar titles in your class? Because you have previously said in a podcast that I listened to in preparation for today, you said something along the lines, bringing social change, academic work, and art together through activism. You want to bring that into your teaching. And if you're too comfortable, you're not really learning, which I thought was a very nice way of kind of putting it. And you use the term radical empathy. So it's very interesting, because a lot of our listeners obviously are early careers, graduates or postgraduates, still in the middle of, but are getting into teaching. So it would be kind of interesting to kind of hear your approach, how you approach radical empathy and making sure students are not too comfortable to keep learning. So all of those kind of teaching tips and insight would be interesting.
Yeah, sure. I fear that with you citing radical empathy and then my subtitle having radical self-care, like it seems like my favorite word. What I will say is that often, like I've taught literature courses that are themed on empathy, and we start with the very basic definition that students provide usually of, oh, you walk a mile and somebody shoots, right? Like that's what empathy is. Like you get a sense of what somebody is feeling and then you're done. And so if we want to differentiate between that form of empathy and what radical empathy is, we can talk about it as being action oriented. And so that's kind of where I end novel subjects too, is once we read these things, what do we do with them? And so one way to think about the difference is to think about like what kind of work is involved, like what kind of daily work is involved in empathizing with somebody. And then also, what limitations does one have on their ability to empathize? You can be part of the same cultural group as somebody else, but then be different in terms of class or gender. And then all of a sudden you've run up against a wall in terms of your ability to empathize. And so being kind of cognizant of those limitations, And then thinking through how you can kind of push up against the limit of that means doing active work in practicing empathy, in reading or thinking or being in places that are outside of your comfort zone, and actively pursuing these, right? So we can talk about sympathy as being kind of this distancing movement where it's just like, oh, I feel for somebody over there, but I'm not going to like move in the direction of really understanding what they're going through. And so when we think about literature, in a lot of ways, it can be this distancing move where you're like, oh, I can read this person's experience and I can get a sense that, oh, things were hard for them. But then what does it mean to kind of move beyond that, like beyond that knowledge even? What does it mean to sit with it for a long time? I think we were talking about this at the beginning before everybody logged in. Like I'm at the end of the semester. In a couple of classes, I'd like to end with John Lewis's graphic memoir, March. And one of the things you see him doing there is he's going through the process of explaining how hard it can be to empathize. And how much of a process that is, like a daily kind of process, like an internal process of thinking what it means to really be in somebody else's shoes. Maybe even especially if that somebody else is very dramatically different from you. So I think that's one way to kind of draw the line between kind of just regular empathy and radical empathy. And so thinking about what that means for students, like what do you do now that you've read this thing, what do you do with it?
Brilliant, thank you. I believe there was a question from Roman first. And can you read that out, Sarah, as it is in the chat? I can't see it.
Sure, yeah. So Roman asks, are there any means to get feedback when you're working on a book? So when you do your PhD dissertation, you might have seminars and conferences, but what about when you're writing a book?
I cannot emphasize enough the power of the writing group. I have a hard time sticking to a task. So I actually have multiple writing accountability groups. So I have different groups. Some of them were just check in on a regular basis and see how you're doing. Have a cocktail together on Zoom. Others were more serious, like we would schedule a couple hours together on Zoom where all you would see was just a bunch of people going like this, right? So just a bunch of us just kind of typing for a certain period of time. You can apply the Pomodoro method to that and like, say 25 minutes of writing and then 5 minutes of checking in. And then built into those groups is the exchange of writing. And so that way the labor is shared, right? You're not just asking a person to read a lot of things for you. You're kind of saying, and in turn, I will read your stuff as well. So those were really helpful. And then I think once you get in community with people at conferences or at grad school, you can find that if you keep in touch, even if like somebody isn't working on something right now, you can kind of say, well, can you read this now? And I know at some point you'll have something for me to read. And so I feel like I've really kind of leaned hard on my lovely networks to help with that kind of thing. Obviously, once you leave grad school, it doesn't mean that you don't have your network anymore. I've kept in touch with numerous people from grad school, both professors and other students. And so I wouldn't discount those things once you're away from grad school. I think they're still there. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Sarah, was there others in the chat?
Yeah, we do. We've got a question from Maria, which is sort of similar to the question that you had asked Aya about teaching, but I'll reiterate the question in case we get some more angles on it. Can you talk about ways in which you've included your ideas and some of the works in novel subjects in your classes?
I'll tell you one bad example and one good example. So I tried pretty early on when I was given the opportunity to kind of teach something that was in my subject area. I tried to have a whole class on metafiction, which is a challenge, in part because if you think about something like Percival Everett's Erasure, right? Like it works really well if you're working with a group of students or readers who have already maybe read Sapphire's Push or Native Son, right? Like then you can read Erasure and you can like really appreciate it. But if you're working with a group who hasn't read some things that metafiction refers to, then you're kind of stuck with, okay, how do I make this work more appreciated by a group that may not recognize like what this author is doing? So that was a disaster. It wasn't a complete disaster, but it was a challenge. I'll just say it was a challenge. Because there's only certain texts that can work in that framework, especially because this was like a general lit class, so it wasn't majors too. But one where it worked well is recently I taught Carmen Maria Machado's Her Body and Other Parties. And so in that class, we read a few of her stories and we talked about The Resident. I would not be, let me preface this by saying I would not be so bold as to demand any of my students buy my books. It's a pretty pricey venture anyway. My library has it on ebook, so I was able to kind of say, supplementary read, you can read the part of the chapter where I talk about The Resident by Carmen Maria Machado. But in that class, we did talk about, it was a women writers class, so this was also, this was an upper level majors class. And in that class, we did actually talk about what are some of the responsibilities of authorship, what are some of the privilege that comes with the woman in The Resident was a person very similar to Carmen Maria Machado, a queer person, but also a person who seems to have these kind of conflicted ideas about what it means to be an author. And so we use that as a way to talk about metafiction and what it can do beyond just this kind of postmodern gameplay, right? So what are some of the ways that metafiction is not just for funsies, but also something that can help us think through, actively think through the process of what it means to tell a story.
Thank you. Any other questions from our attendees at the moment?
So we have a question from Molly. Molly asks in the chat, the authors you mentioned are from such a fascinating range of backgrounds. Did you find that authors from different cultures and backgrounds approach writing metafiction differently? And if so, how did you negotiate that while writing the thesis in the book?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think I had many anxieties about both the dissertation and the book, and one of the big ones was because I'm doing something that's a bit more comparatist. I didn't want anybody to get the impression that I was kind of lumping together non-white authors or marginalized authors in any particular way. And so I tried very hard to kind of say that there are ways in which the way that they're dealing with metafiction is similar, but there's also references that make them very particular to their groups and to their experiences. So yeah, I think one way to answer that question is to think about thematic elements. So for example, with chapter 1, thinking about what it means to be a colonized subject in the United States, or what it means to be a person who comes from a previously colonized country, or a country who's experienced kind of imperialist consequences of US intervention, and then kind of using that as a way to think about what it means to be a US citizen, or what it means to be an American, and what it means to be an author. Like those kind of particularities, I feel there are ways that we can talk about overlaps between them while not also kind of painting this monolithic picture of what it means to be, say, a person of color. And so that tension was very much something that I don't think I tried to skirt it, but I also tried to kind of focus on the commonalities that had more to do with shared experiences broadly, but also experiences of marginalization. I don't know if that answered the question.
Thank you. Off the back of that, I wanted to ask a question again about this, the variety that you have on your list of texts that you look at in the book. And I wonder, just on like a practical level, did you have certain texts in mind when you went into the project? And if so, which ones were they and why? Or was it that you kind of discovered them and pieced them together as the project gained shape? And did they change in any way?
Yes. So again, maybe this is maybe this is not the best advice, but one of the things that I started with when I was doing the dissertation was I was just like, I just like certain books and I just want to write about them. I don't really know how they connect to each other, but these are books that I like. And these are things that I find that I'm reading a lot. And so maybe there's a way that I can, at this, like literally the last stage in my career as a student, like, can I just write about the things I like for once, right? And I feel like that sort of impulse, especially as a person who like didn't even read anything by a Filipino American author until I was a master's student. Right. And so that kind of impulse for me is what led me to say, well, I'm going to include at least 2 Filipino American authors in my project, because I want to, right? But then there was also this feeling that there was something that they were trying to say, and if I just sat with it long enough, I would figure it out. And that's my version. That's like as close to a version of a research question as I had at the time. As far as anything that changed, I think at one point, a member of my committee who's not here was questioning the categories of nationality that I had in terms of whether an author was really an American author or not. And I realized very quickly from that conversation that there are ways in which these authors were pushing the boundaries of what it meant to be an American author, or what it meant to be part of a different group. And so that was the other thing that I found myself, if you want to call it defending, I found myself defending in terms of this group of authors, is to what extent that they are commenting on what it means to be part of the US. And then really the only change, I was debating whether to talk about this. The only major changes that I made between the dissertation and the book manuscript, well, I made a lot of changes. I changed pretty much everything. Like the central argument, the kind of underlying argument behind the central argument changed. And I updated a lot of the scholarship and so on. But one of the major changes in the book list itself was, at one point I had Junot Diaz as Junot Diaz, the Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, obviously a very metafictional book, but obviously a very problematic author. And I honestly didn't want to give him any more space. And so I switched him out with one of the people that he treated improperly, which is Carmen Maria Machado. And it turned out to be a very great fit. And I love Machado anyway. And so it was just a good opportunity for me to kind of get rid of one author and put another author in his place.
Thank you, Leah. And we have another question from Tom in the chat. Thank you for all this useful advice. What's the greatest challenge you've encountered in moving beyond this extraordinary success to crafting and getting inspired for your next project?
Oh, wow, that's very kind of you. I think similar to when I finished the dissertation, I just dealt with just pure exhaustion. I just didn't want to do anything for a while. I don't see one of my writing group members here anymore, but what really helped me move on to the next thing was working with a brilliant group of people who got me excited about something else. Another thing was just at this point in terms of my career advancement, a second book is a thing I could do, but it's not necessarily a requirement. And so I feel like I have the luxury, and again, this is very unique and lucky for me. I feel like I have the luxury to write about what I want, to a certain extent, right? And so that gives me kind of the power to just say, well, what do I want to learn more about, or what do I want to be more skillful at? Emily Redder is not here anymore, but she and I are working with a group of other people on Black women's poetry and thinking through just some of the shared themes that they have there. And with these collections, what I found myself doing was really pursuing a field that I am not very comfortable with. If you can't tell from novel subjects, I am very much a prose person. And so this was just my opportunity to be better at reading and writing about poetry. And so that was something that I could pursue as like a learning project and something I could be excited about. And like I said, I had the luxury of kind of exploring something different. Oh, I see it. I see it. No, wait. as I was about to say, I thought that was a question, but I see Laura in the chat talking about.
I think you're just getting a lot of compliments for all your
Yeah.
beautiful insight here. So it's good to check in on the chat for that as well sometimes. I read somewhere, if I may jump in, someone said as an advice in the process of turning your dissertation into a book that you have to impress your committee to get a PhD, but you have to impress the presses to get a career. Your book establishes your career trajectory for decades. So I was just wondering what thoughts you have as someone who has gone through that process, because it seems kind of a heavy pressure to put on for everyone. I mean, I agree with it a lot, but in a way, it also seems like if you don't publish a book and if it's not the most radical and innovative and, you know, not too long and not too short, you know, just right, like Alice in Wonderland style book, you're not going to have a career, which was just kind of a daunting thought as well.
Yeah, it was a daunting thought that did not help me at all. So what I ended up doing was treating treating to a certain extent, right? Treating the dissertation as a dissertation. And what I learned in the process of writing the book was that there was a lot of dissertation-y stuff that I had that wasn't really necessary. For example, just footnotes with stuff that I read just to say that I read them, right? Like it's like, oh well, I know about these things. And then once you get to the book, it's almost a given that you're going to know about certain things about a field, and so you just get rid of that stuff, right? And so I honestly, I mean, I don't know, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I honestly think you should just write the dissertation as a dissertation. People are gonna have their own opinions for what the book should be. In the copy editing process alone, my copy editor found, I want to say it was like 180 things. Like some of it was just commas, some of it was like I literally put the wrong subtitle on one of my books. Like it, you know, like there's going to be change anyway. And so I wouldn't get too hung up on what if the dissertation isn't good enough to be a book, because maybe it's not, but maybe that, like, you just need to graduate, right? Like, so just do the dissertation, get it good enough that your committee is happy with it, that they feel okay putting their names on it. And then the book may be something completely different. And that's okay too. All that work is not wasted work. It's just work that led to you getting to this point.
Absolutely. And dissertation is a whole different can of worms, isn't it? It has to be written in a certain way. There are rules that we have to follow. Because another advice given to me once is someone who has a PhD but now works as a publisher in trade publishing as well, not academic publishing. And she said, you should plan your dissertation and write your dissertation as if you're writing a book from the beginning. And I that just doesn't really work with all the rules we have to follow.
A lot of pressure too. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I also really liked how you were saying you replaced a author with someone who they mistreated, because I'm writing my dissertation basically on the same principle. I'm telling someone with 100,000 words that they were wrong about something. They said that women are not as interesting and there's not much there to research in what I'm doing. So I'm writing 100,000 words to say you're wrong. So I do appreciate that. I thought that was, and I think someone mentioned that in the comments as well, that it's a beautiful thing to do and to consider and kind of explain as well, not just do it within the book, because we would have never know, but I mentioned that as well. And I think that's appreciated.
Yeah, righteous anger is a good motivator, I think. So yeah, lean into that.
Absolutely. Is there any other questions there in the chat or with any of the attendees there at the moment? No, I do have a question, and because again, I've listened to this Imagine Otherwise podcast from 2017, so that's a bit of a time ago. But you said about, so how would you advise reading novel subjects for someone who hasn't read it yet, because you said a good trouble of social activism is something that you kind of, at that time, because at that time you were still kind of processing everything, you were kind of getting to that point of making this book, you still had a different title and everything at the time. So how would you advise someone, your readers, to face or get challenged mostly when they're reading novel subjects?
So I'll answer that two ways. If you're a person who's already, like, if you're a person who's reading this who's already familiar with metafiction, I think this is maybe my obnoxious defense of a potentially obnoxious subgenre, and to say that there are ways in which this is being used in creatively interesting and serious ways. I mean, if you look at Percival Everett by Virgil Russell, like he's writing out of grief. Like this is the first book he wrote after his father passed, and you can see him literally grappling with what it means to grieve and to tell the story of his father. And then you also see him grappling with himself and what it means to go back to writing after he's just had this, momentous thing happen to him. And at the same time, you have the story, right? So the story of the novel itself. And so all those things are happening at once. And I think it's that combination of those things that makes the potential for metafiction so endless. Like there's ways in which like that kind of building on conversations, or that layering of conversations, is just it just leads to the potential for so much kind of thinking about identity, about who we are, about our history. And then I think if you're just somebody who's reading this who isn't familiar with metafiction, another way to think about this is that term authenticity. So what does it mean that we read people in a certain way, and that we're only comfortable with reading people in a certain way? So if you look at, for example, I don't know if you guys have Yelp in the UK, but if you look at like those restaurant review sites and you see how they talk about quote unquote ethnic restaurants, the word authenticity just gets bandied about all the time, right? Like they're like, oh, this is an authentic Mexican restaurant and this one isn't. And oftentimes those boundaries or those boxes are drawn in very specific ways that one might, if they read novel subjects, be asked to question. So why is a Thai restaurant authentic if it's like a hole in the wall, but not authentic if it becomes high end, right? And so thinking about like how our ideas of authentic cultural identities intersect with something like class or gender. I think that's another kind of good way to think about how to read novel subjects. Is it's asking us to question how we read people and how we read groups of people, and why we impose certain kind of boxes of or boundaries of authenticity upon certain groups.
Yeah, and that comes back to what you said about the self-preservation as well, doesn't it? I was wondering as well when I was reading parts of the book that how do you define the borders of the literary homelands and identities in that kind of political warfare that you mentioned during your presentation as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Miguel Sahuco's Ilustrado is a really good one for this, because he's literally talking in that about these two novelists who are part of a diaspora, and thinking about what it means to write for their homeland, like their literal homeland, for their diaspora, and then thinking about like where that literary homeland exists, and it exists somewhere in both places, but also in between. And so, especially as we're looking at a more globalized culture, like this idea of what actually American studies is something that we have to think about, right? Like where do we draw the lines around what counts as American studies and what doesn't? And we can see the author sort of pushing against those kind of conventional boundaries that we have put in universities or in kind of literary theory and so on around these kind of categories, and saying, well, where did these boundaries come from, and why are we drawing these lines these ways? And what happens if we get rid of those lines altogether? Like, what does that allow us to do, or what potential does that open up that wasn't there in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. One final round for questions, if any, because we're drawing to the end of an hour, and Leah's given us so much. I don't want to take the rest of her day. Any questions at the moment, Sarah, that you can see? No. That's okay. So Leah, I would really like to thank you for taking this time and giving this fantastic presentation and a lot of insight into your process and writing and this massive reading list that we all now have when we finish this and getting the books. I have some of them already from before, but they're on my to be read pile since forever. So now I'm more kind of excited to start reading them as well. So thank you very, very much. And just
Thank
as a
you.
reminder,
Yeah, go ahead. And you guys have my contact information, so you know I obviously love talking about books. So feel free to follow up with any questions that you have.
it's a very big invite there. You get a lot of hopeful, especially postgraduates about to finish. You're going to get a lot of people contacting you, I'm sure.
Perfectly fine. Yeah.
And just as a reminder for everyone, this has been recorded, so we will be putting this up on YouTube. So feel free to kind of share it amongst yourselves. And I know, Leah, you wanted to, then I'll send you an email to confirm when it's up so you can share it with those who can attend today. So thank you, everyone. If you know any other books, you can always contact US Studies Online as well for reviews. Thank you and have a wonderful evening or day, depending where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.